The judge froze in court when he saw me, his eyes wide, his gavel hovering midair, a silent gasp caught in his throat. No one in that courtroom, not the jury, not the lawyers, not even my own supposed family, knew who I really was until that exact moment. They thought they knew me, the meek, quiet daughter, the one who never caused trouble, the one they had all systematically tried to erase. But they were wrong. So incredibly wrong. Was I wrong for the secret I kept, for the calculated silence, for letting them dig their own graves with every lie they spun? Tell me, if you had been me, would you have done the same thing, or would you have shouted your truth from the rooftops the moment you had the chance? It all started, as most nightmares do, with a perfectly normal morning. I was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in business, and optimistic about a future that I truly believed was mine to build. I lived in a cozy, one-bedroom apartment, just far enough from my parents' sprawling suburban house to feel independent, but close enough for the Sunday dinners that were an unbreakable tradition. My father, Richard, was a well-respected, even revered, judge in our small town, known for his stern demeanor and unwavering commitment to justice. My mother, Eleanor, was the epitome of Southern charm and grace, a pillar of the community, always organizing charity events and hosting elegant soirees. To the outside world, we were the perfect family. The truth, as it often is, was far more twisted. My older sister, Clara, was the golden child, the brilliant artist, the free spirit. She was 3 years older than me, and from the moment I could understand, I knew I was her shadow, her less interesting counterpart. I loved Clara fiercely, despite the constant comparisons, despite feeling like I was always grasping for a fraction of the attention she effortlessly commanded. She was vibrant, passionate, and, unlike me, unafraid to challenge our father's rigid views. This often led to explosive arguments, typically at those Sunday dinners, with my mother playing peacemaker, subtly always siding with Clara. I just sat there, eating my mashed potatoes, wishing I could disappear. My childhood was a blur of trying to be seen, of striving for academic perfection, of practicing piano for hours, all in the desperate hope that one day, my father would look at me with the same pride he reserved for Clara. It never happened. He'd nod, maybe a brief, "Good job, Elizabeth," but his eyes would always drift back to Clara, who was usually off in her own world, sketching in a corner or passionately debating a political point with him. My mother, while outwardly affectionate, always had a way of making me feel like an accessory, a smaller, quieter version of her perfect daughter. It was an unspoken hierarchy, a family dynamic etched in stone. Then, the unthinkable happened. Clara was involved in a horrific car accident. A drunk driver, coming home from a late-night party, swerved into her lane. She didn't stand a chance. The news shattered our family, or what I thought was our family. My parents were inconsolable. The house, once filled with Clara's laughter and occasional fiery debates, became a tomb of silence and grief. I grieved too, deeply, profoundly. Clara was not just my sister, she was my confidant, the one person who occasionally saw past the quiet facade to the real me. She was the one who would sneak me her art supplies, encouraging me to draw, even though my parents wanted me to focus on practical things. After her death, I felt like a part of me died too. The drunk driver, a young man named Mark Jensen, was arrested. The case was open and shut. He pleaded guilty to vehicular manslaughter and was sentenced to 10 years. My father, naturally, recused himself from any involvement, but his influence in the local legal community was immense. Everyone knew he expected the book to be thrown at Jensen. The first few months after Clara's death were a haze of tears and numbness. My parents were consumed by their sorrow, barely acknowledging my existence. I cooked, I cleaned, I tried to pick up the pieces, but it was like trying to mend a shattered vase with invisible glue. They spoke of Clara constantly, reminiscing about her brilliance, her vivacity, her plans. I listened, my heart aching, and I started to feel a bitter resentment fester. It wasn't just grief for Clara. It was grief for the daughter they had lost, and complete indifference to the daughter who was still standing right in front of them, broken and alone. One evening, about 6 months after the accident, I overheard a conversation between my parents in the study. The door was slightly ajar, and I was just walking past, on my way to get a glass of water. My father's voice was low, laced with a cold anger that sent a shiver down my spine. "We need to address this, Eleanor," he said. "The inheritance. Clara was set to inherit everything. Elizabeth, well, she was never really part of the plan, was she?" My mother's voice, usually so sweet, had an edge to it. Richard, darling, let's not be crude. Of course, Elizabeth is our daughter. But Clara was special. Her legacy, her art, it deserves to be protected. Elizabeth is capable, yes, but she's not. Clara. My blood ran cold. Everything. Clara was set to inherit everything. Not just money, but a trust fund, a sprawling art collection, a lakeside cottage that had been in our family for generations, a place Clara had always dreamed of turning into an artist's retreat. And I, the invisible daughter, was to get nothing. I stood there, frozen, listening as they discussed how to discreetly transfer Clara's assets into a foundation in her name, a foundation that they would control, effectively cutting me out entirely. It wasn't about need. I had a good job, I was self-sufficient. It was about principle. It was about being told, explicitly, that I was worth nothing, that my future was inconsequential, that even in death, Clara's shadow was all-consuming. That night, something inside me snapped. The quiet, obedient Elizabeth began to die, and someone new, someone harder, colder, started to awaken. I spent weeks in a silent rage, going through the motions of my life, but inside, a meticulous plan was forming. I started digging. Not for dirt on my parents, not yet, but for anything, any loophole, any legal precedent that could challenge their intent. My business degree had taught me how to research, how to analyze data, how to find the cracks in a system. I found them. My father, the esteemed judge, had a past. A past that involved a small, ethically questionable investment scheme from his early days as a lawyer, long before he became a judge. It was minor, swept under the rug, involving a few shady real estate deals. Nothing illegal enough to cost him his career, but certainly enough to taint his reputation if exposed. My mother, with all her charity work, had a tendency to blend personal funds with foundation funds, always for administrative costs or unforeseen expenses. Again, nothing that would send her to jail, but definitely a pattern of financial impropriety that would look terrible in the eyes of the public. I gathered everything, meticulously, patiently. Bank statements, old newspaper clippings, obscure land deeds. I built a case, piece by piece, against the very people who had raised me, the people who were now trying to erase me. I knew what I was doing was drastic, perhaps even cruel. But the alternative was to accept my fate as the forgotten daughter, to let them walk all over me, and I couldn't do it. Not anymore. I had to fight fire with fire. And I had a weapon they never saw coming, their own hubris. So that's the situation I was in. They thought I was an afterthought, a quiet mouse, and they were systematically trying to cut me out of a legacy that, by rights, should have been shared. I had this information, this damning evidence against them, hidden away. Before I tell you what happened next, what I actually did, I want you to pause right now and comment below. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have confronted them directly? Would you have walked away and tried to build your own life? Or would you have played their game, used their own tactics against them, and brought everything crashing down? I'm genuinely curious to know what you think. My moment came with the reading of Clara's will. My parents, of course, had already orchestrated everything they thought they needed to. They had a lawyer, a family friend, who had drawn up the documents for the Clara Elizabeth Rhodes Memorial Foundation, which would effectively control all of Clara's assets, with my parents as the primary trustees. I received a formal invitation to the reading, a cold, impersonal letter, as if I were a distant relative rather than Clara's sister. I arrived, dressed in a simple black dress, my face composed, my emotions carefully locked away. My parents were there, looking suitably somber, my mother clutching a lace handkerchief. The lawyer, Mr. Davies, began to read the will. It was exactly as I expected. Clara's deep love for art, her desire to support young artists, her wish for her legacy to live on through the foundation. And then, the clause that solidified my fate. All remaining assets, properties, and intellectual rights to my artistic works shall be transferred to the Clara Elizabeth Rhodes Memorial Foundation, to be administered by my beloved parents, Richard and Eleanor Rhodes, as primary trustees. My parents exchanged a subtle, triumphant glance. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, about to move on to the next item, when I spoke. My voice, usually soft, was clear and steady, cutting through the somber air of the room. "Excuse me, Mr. Davies," I said. "There seems to be a slight oversight." My father's head snapped towards me, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. My mother gave me a tight, strained smile. Elizabeth, darling, please. This is a delicate matter. Indeed it is, mother, I replied, meeting her gaze evenly. And I believe Clara would have wanted her true wishes to be honored. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a stack of documents, neatly bound. Because, you see, Clara updated her will. About a month before her accident. The room went silent. My parents' faces drained of color. Mr. Davies looked startled. Ms. Rhodes, I assure you, I have the most recent version on file. Oh, I'm sure you do, Mr. Davies, I said, a slight, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. But Clara was a pragmatic woman, as well as an artist. She knew the importance of diversifying. She knew about family dynamics. And she knew that a last-minute revision, sent through a private courier to an independent law firm, might ensure her true intentions were honored without interference. I handed the documents to Mr. Davies. He took them, his brow furrowed, and began to read. My parents watched him, their expressions shifting from bewilderment to dawning horror. The new will, dated 3 weeks before Clara's death, was short and to the point. It established the Clara Elizabeth Rhodes Memorial Foundation, yes, but with a crucial difference. It named me, Elizabeth Rhodes, as co-trustee, with equal say and equal access to all funds. Furthermore, it explicitly stated that in the event of any attempt by either parent to remove me as co-trustee or to undermine my authority, the entire estate would immediately revert to a charitable trust, with no involvement from our family whatsoever. It was brilliant. It was Clara's final, silent rebellion. And she had entrusted it to me. The will also contained a personal letter, addressed to both my parents and me. It was read aloud by a visibly shaken Mr. Davies. In it, Clara spoke of her love for both of us, but also of her deep concern about the imbalance in our family, about the way I had been consistently overlooked. She wrote, "My art, my legacy, is not just for me. It is for the future. And Elizabeth, my dear sister, has the practical mind, the grounded sense, to ensure it truly thrives. She deserves this responsibility, and I trust her implicitly to carry out my true vision, unburdened by past expectations." The tension in the room was palpable. My father's jaw was clenched, his face a mask of fury struggling with disbelief. My mother looked utterly devastated, not just by the change in the will, but by Clara's words, which were a direct condemnation of their behavior. The aftermath was a hurricane. My parents refused to accept the new will. They accused me of forging it, of manipulating Clara in her final days. They threatened legal action. But I was ready. I had anticipated this. The new will was notarized, authenticated by a reputable, independent law firm. Clara had contacted herself, a firm known for its discretion and integrity. My parents' lawyer, Mr. Davies, after verifying the authenticity of the signatures and the dating, had no choice but to concede. The fight then moved to the courtroom, instigated by my parents, who were desperate to reclaim full control. They filed a petition, claiming undue influence, questioning Clara's mental state at the time of the revised will. It was a vicious, public attack on both Clara's memory and my character. This is where my hidden knowledge came into play. I hadn't just prepared for their legal challenge regarding Clara's will, I had prepared for their complete and utter downfall. I knew that in a courtroom setting, under oath, certain truths have a way of surfacing. The day of the hearing arrived. It was a packed courtroom. News of Judge Rhodes' family drama had spread like wildfire through our small town. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table, looking regal and aggrieved, playing the part of the grieving, wronged parents perfectly. I sat at the defendant's table, alone, facing them. My father, Richard, was called to the stand first. He spoke eloquently of his love for Clara, his heartbreak, his conviction that I had taken advantage of his family's grief. He looked directly at the judge, a colleague of his, appealing to a sense of professional camaraderie. The opposing counsel, my parents' lawyer, led him through a narrative designed to paint me as opportunistic and manipulative. When it was time for cross-examination, my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I had hired from out of town, began her questioning. She started gently, establishing my father's extensive legal career, his reputation for integrity. Then she shifted. "Judge Rhodes," she began, "you have always been a staunch advocate for justice, for fairness, have you not?" "Absolutely," he affirmed, puffing out his chest. "And you believe in full transparency, especially when it comes to financial dealings related to public trusts or foundations?" "Without question." My lawyer then produced a series of documents, the very ones I had painstakingly gathered. Judge Rhodes, can you explain these entries from 1998 related to the Willow Creek Development Group? She held up copies of old bank statements, land deeds, and correspondence. My father's face, usually so composed, paled. He stammered, those are old business dealings. Private matters. Indeed. Private matters that, at the time, involved a considerable investment from a community development fund that you, as a then city councilman, oversaw, she pressed. And these funds were later identified as having questionable origins, resulting in a quiet internal investigation and your subsequent decision to recuse yourself from further involvement. She didn't accuse him of anything criminal, but the implication was clear, a pattern of ethical ambiguity, a history of using his position for personal gain. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder. He was sweating, visibly uncomfortable. The judge on the bench, a man who had known my father for decades, looked at him with a mixture of shock and concern. My mother was next. She was asked about the Clara Elizabeth Rhodes Memorial Foundation my parents had intended to establish before the new will surfaced. My lawyer asked her to detail the proposed administrative costs, the projected operating budget. My mother, confident in her charitable persona, began to elaborate on the vast sums that would be required to maintain Clara's legacy, to promote her art, to manage the foundation. Then my lawyer, with a polite but firm tone, presented her with another set of documents. Mrs. Rhodes, these are the audited financial statements from the Greenwood Children's Gala, a charity event you spearheaded last year. Can you explain why a significant portion of the funds, earmarked for children's literacy programs, appear to have been diverted to cover personal travel expenses and discretionary family entertainment costs? My mother's composure crumbled. Her face turned a blotchy red. She denied it vehemently, but the evidence, meticulously gathered by me, was undeniable. Receipts, booking confirmations, all showing lavish trips and expenses that bore no resemblance to charity work. The murmurs in the courtroom turned into outright gasps. Her carefully constructed image as the benevolent community matriarch shattered before everyone's eyes. Then, it was my turn to be called to the stand by my own lawyer. As I walked towards the witness box, I made eye contact with my father, who was still seated at the plaintiff's table. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of rage and dawning comprehension. He saw me, really saw me, for the first time in his life. Not the quiet shadow, but the architect of his unraveling. And then, he froze. His gavel, which he had idly picked up, hovered in his hand. He understood. He finally understood who I really was. I was not just Elizabeth, his forgotten daughter. I was the person who had quietly, methodically, used his own lessons in law and justice against him, exposing the hypocrisy that lay beneath his carefully cultivated public image. I was the person who had done what Clara couldn't, what Clara wouldn't, because she was too good, too pure. I was the one who was willing to get my hands dirty, to fight for what was right, even if it meant tearing down everything they had built. As I took the oath, my voice steady, my gaze unwavering, I felt a strange sense of calm. All the pain, all the years of neglect, all the silent resentment, it had culminated in this moment. I recounted my story, calmly, factually. I spoke of Clara's love, her artistic dreams, and her genuine concern for me. I presented the independent testimony of the courier who delivered the revised will, the notary, and the lawyers from the independent firm who had handled the revision, all confirming Clara's sound mind and clear intentions. I didn't gloat. I didn't revel in their discomfort. I simply stated the truth that they had tried to bury. The judge, my father's colleague, ultimately ruled in my favor. The revised will stood. The Clara Elizabeth Rhodes Memorial Foundation was to be established with me as co-trustee, alongside my parents, ensuring that Clara's legacy would be administered with transparency and genuine care. My parents were furious, of course. My father's reputation took a severe hit, though his position as a judge remained, albeit with a dark cloud hanging over it. My mother's social standing plummeted. They tried to ostracize me, but the public, having witnessed their hypocrisy, largely sided with me. They saw me as the one who had finally stood up for the truth, for Clara's true wishes. The aftermath wasn't just about the money, or the foundation. It was about reclaiming my own identity. I finally felt seen, not as Clara's shadow, but as Elizabeth, a woman capable of fighting for herself and for what she believed in. I dedicated myself to the foundation, working tirelessly to honor Clara's vision, supporting young artists, and ensuring that every penny went to its intended purpose. My relationship with my parents is, to this day, strained. We exist in a fragile truce, bound by our shared responsibility to Clara's memory. But the power dynamic has shifted. They know now that I am not to be underestimated. I am no longer invisible. The silence that once enveloped me was a breeding ground for strength, a quiet determination they never bothered to notice. So, that's my story. It was a messy, painful, and ultimately liberating experience. The judge froze, the courtroom gasped, and I, the forgotten daughter, finally stepped into the light. I learned that sometimes the quietest people hold the biggest secrets and the greatest power. Like this video if you were on my side, if you think I did the right thing by standing up for myself and for Clara's true wishes. Subscribe for more stories like this, where the meek inherit the unexpected. And please, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section below. What would you have done differently? Do you think justice was served? I want to hear your perspectives. I'll see you all in the next story.